Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Tolima Alberizon Prada Geisha wash processed Colombia from Mel Coffee Roasters. And there's the box right there. And Mel, based out of Osaka, Japan. And once again, this coffee was a gift from Lucy, so once again, a quick shout out to and thank you to Lucy for this coffee. And of the 4 coffees that Lucy brought us back from Osaka and Kyoto, this is the coffee roaster that I had the least amount of familiarity with, as I had at least heard of the other 3 coffee roasters, but this one right here, I'd never heard of before we received this box of coffee. And what will make this review even more interesting is that I was able to find very little information about this coffee, as I don't even know if it's technically a wash processed coffee. I'm going based off what I know about this specific coffee as well as the experience that we did have, as it's not technically labeled anywhere what the actual processing of this coffee is. And I wasn't able to find any flavor notes for this coffee either, as they're not particularly descriptive about it in general. So this should make for a pretty interesting review, as this right here is day 48. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our Lilo recipe once again, which is a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 92 degrees Celsius, about 197 degrees Fahrenheit. And I actually like this one best through the Chemex, which does indicate a more medium grind. Roast profile for this coffee. This is actually a pretty good comparison, as it wasn't quite as light as the Sloth coffee, which is the other Osaka-based coffee roaster we'd reviewed, but it does feel a little lighter than the coffee that we did have from Lilo and the one that we had from Aoma as well. Now, a good comparison with an American-based coffee roaster is that this one did have some similarities to the La Prada that we had reviewed from Bots earlier this year, and I can say that it actually felt a little lighter than that coffee, so that would indicate this one being a little bit more on that medium light side of things, maybe on the slightly more developed side of that, but hopefully that gives you a pretty good idea. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 19, first impression through the V60, and the coffee definitely had that Colombian berry feel to it, as the coffee is presented in a slightly more clean sense. Now, this one is a geisha, so in theory you would expect it to be on the cleaner side of things, but it's mostly skewing on the red forward themed aspects of this coffee in both the fruit and floral sense, not overly light, but it's been pretty on par with the expectations that we did have for a Japanese-based coffee roaster. Some slight sweeter citrus in the cool down, but for the most part, I would say a decent start. As of the 4 coffees that we did have, this is the one that I was probably the most intrigued by based off of the first try. Day 22 through the V60 and through the Chemex, and the coffee is a little bit dialed back from the previous day, as it feels a little bit more classic Japanese style in terms of the development, as it's hindered quite a bit by that on the experience today. Not particularly clean or well defined, as it's offering a more traditional and generic robust feel to it for it being a Colombian coffee, which isn't ideal given that it is a geisha. So I was expecting maybe a little bit more out of it, but it definitely did offer some more roasty qualities to it. Day 25 through the UFO brewer, and the coffee is the best it had been to this point, as it's offering a little bit more intensity in that Colombian berry sense, but also the florality is also skewing in a slight red sense. Better level of sweetness with a citric sense, with the coffee essentially feeling a little bit improved overall. So that did give me some hope and optimism that this coffee would improve with some adjustments, as at this time we were still working with some lower extraction adjustments on the UFO brewer. Day 28 through the V60 with those lower extraction adjustments, so that 15:1 and 92 Celsius. And the coffee was the best it had been to this point, as it's significantly better balanced and sweet, offering some more of the red fruit qualities in a slightly artificial sugary candy sense, and a sweeter citric quality as well. Generally more red forward, and as a result, I definitely enjoyed this experience significantly more. And going into it with very little idea of what to expect from this coffee, I was just super happy with how sugary this one did turn out to be. So having that be something different as of this moment definitely did help the overall experience. Day 31 through the Chemex with the same adjustments. And the coffee was the best it had been to this point, as it's offering a very nice level of sweetness and clarity in a much more prominent sugary candy sense. And it's almost pixie stick-like in a lot of ways. And I wrote that note, and I do want to highlight and document this. I actually wrote that note specifically before who is it? H&S released their most recent Ecuadorian Mejorado coffee, which does have a pixie stick note listed on there. And it did make me kind of laugh that another coffee roaster was kind of picking out those notes from a coffee too. So given that it had that very strong artificial sugary candy sense with a slight tartness to it, that's the note that I opted to highlight for this coffee. And then when H&S would shortly release the coffee after that, it just kind of made me laugh on that one. Let's go ahead and move on, as on day 34, we opted for the V60 with those lower extraction adjustments once again. And I'm kind of enjoying this coffee, as it's nice overall with that darker Colombian berry feel to it and plenty of the prominent artificial candy sugar sweetness to it. The cleanliness has a moderate ceiling, as it's a cleaner experience for a Ethiopian coffee, for a Colombian coffee, with a fair bit of citric brightness to it. And this is all taking into context that I still don't technically know the processing. For all I know, it could be a honey processed Colombian coffee, but even honey processed Colombian coffees these days tend to turn out a fair bit more fermenty than something like this would be. Day 37 through the Chemex with the lower extraction adjustments, and it's another nice day of this coffee, as it's offering more of that strong artificial sugary sweetness in a cleaner sense. And I keep going back to that mostly because it just had that pixie stick like feel every single time we were brewing it from that point going forward. Definitely Colombian in the berry qualities, solid overall. And on day 40, final notes we have through the Chemex with the lower extraction adjustments, and the coffee does continue to offer plenty of the artificial sugary sweetness that's been very consistent with this one, and the prominent red berry qualities to it. That being said, there's a pretty prominent red theme in this one, as there's a rose-like quality, as this one was very reminiscent of the La Pradera, which they had listed on it. I want to say like Sweethearts, or the Sweet Tart candies was one of the more defining aspects of that coffee. Cleaner, feels a little less developed overall with the adjustments that we've made. Even then, not going to be your lightest coffee, but it feels like it also might be on the decline as of this moment, as I think the coffee had probably peaked around that day 34 mark for us. Day 34, day 31 mark. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s. Let's go through those. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4. So even with a little bit more of that developed quality, even with a lot of the prominent Colombian berry qualities to it, there really wasn't any sort of fermentiness or funkiness to it. And it would make me laugh if this coffee was a bit more processed, because then that would go against everything that I believe when it comes to more processed Colombian coffees. But I think that it presented and acted enough in a way that it was representative of a wash processed Colombian coffee. And if it's that the Geisha really did a lot of the heavy lifting and helped this one maintain a fair level of clarity, then fair play to it. Level 4, where we opted to put it, it does have some really nice definition to it and some pretty nice cleanliness for a Colombian coffee, as even these days, wash processed Colombian coffees like that La Pradera that we'd reviewed from bots can feel not the cleanest. Finish, level 4. And the finish is, I would say, interesting, mostly because you would expect it to be very strong on that sugary candy sense, and it can be, but at the same time, I think more of the citric qualities do take a hold as the coffee has kind of cooled down. It does become a bit more prominent. It reminds me maybe a little bit more of a mandarin quality to it, so for that reason, the finish is at the level 4 mark, and the sweetness is at the level 4. Of the 4 coffees that we did discuss that we received from these Japanese coffee roasters, this one was actually the sweetest. And I'm very curious as to what roasting machine Mel uses, because the way that this one presented itself would indicate once again that it's probably on some sort of drum roaster. But I was very intrigued by the overall sweetness of this coffee, because it reminded me a little bit of the La Pradera from Bots, but in a little bit sweeter of a sense. So I really appreciated the sweetness within this coffee. Very, very sweet for what it was. It actually did verge on the level 5 a lot of the time. Kind of reminded me a little bit of something like a cotton candy. Let's go ahead and move on to the florality level 4. I think that there were some pretty interesting rosewater qualities to this one, given the overall red theme of this coffee, and it didn't have too much of an herbal trait to kind of contrast that. So level 4, where we opted to put that, really appreciated that about the red quality to this coffee. Berry fruit, level 4. Take your pick. I feel like when it comes to Colombian coffees, they have this very distinct berry quality to them that if they're presented in a little bit more tart of a sense, you can think of stuff like, I don't know, currants. Or if they're presented in a little bit more of a heavier sense, then usually you come up with something like cherry. But this one for me, just a little bit more of that darker kind of blueberry feel to it, which is also a pretty prominent Colombian berry quality. And I would say that since it's presented in a much cleaner sense, it has a little bit more of that kind of generic dark berry feel. And I feel like at this moment, if somebody just put Colombian berry as one of the notes for a coffee, then I can just kind of see that and have a pretty good idea of what that tastes like. Because even these days, washed Colombian coffees taste like that a lot of the time, but then the more processed you get with those coffees, the more heavy they taste in that specific sense. So level 4, where we opted to put it, probably thinking a little bit more on that red berry side of things, but a little bit cleaner of that red berry side of things. Citrus fruit, level 3, I already mentioned that there is that mandarin-like quality to it. We're moving on to level 3s, by the way. So that was probably the second most prominent fruit quality to this coffee. We're going to go back through this tasting wheel. The acidity, level 3, a little bit of brightness to it. I don't think that this coffee ever was going to skew too heavily in that direction, which is another indicator that it wasn't a more processed Colombian coffee. When it comes to those more processed Colombian coffees, the acidity almost always seems to be completely out of whack. So having it be at a much more palatable and toned down sense does indicate that it probably was a wash processed coffee. Caramel, level 3, that's that super sweet cotton candy feel to this one, that pixie stick like feel. It was very prominent once we got this coffee at the point that I felt it was at its best. So level 3, where we opted to put that. Probably could have been even higher than that, maybe a level 4 to go along with a very high level of sweetness to this one. And then the final thing worth discussing, the body at a level 3. Definitely still had plenty of body and texture to it. When it comes to Colombian geishas, I kind of toss my expectations out the window because obviously geishas would indicate probably going to be lighter bodied, but when it comes to Colombian coffees, you never really know what to expect. They're usually going to be a little bit more medium bodied in general. And even with this one being brewed with the Chemex, it still had plenty of body and texture to it, even compared to the other Japanese coffees that we'd recently reviewed. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I mentioned in our most recent review of these 4 coffees, I'm trying to think, which one was that? The Sloth review, that we did review them in order of which one was our favorites. And this one was actually my favorite, mostly because it did taste like a cleaner and less developed version of that La Pradera that we'd had from Bots, which I wasn't the biggest fan of that coffee, but this one right here, the sweetness really got to me. And if there's going to be a very unique and different sort of sweetness that a coffee is offering, then it's going to at the very least catch my interest. That's one way to make a coffee just more interesting to me. And since it did score relatively higher on the other qualities of this one, I'm thinking the florality, the cleanliness, and the fruit quality, then it was a pretty interesting experience overall. Now, I'm kind of curious about what other things this coffee roaster does offer, primarily because of just how interesting the sweetness was within this coffee. So that's all to say. Easily my favorite of the 4 coffees. I just found this one to be by far the most interesting of them, even if it wasn't necessarily the lightest of them. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like if you really liked the La Pradera, but you were looking for something maybe a little bit lighter, then this one offers a lot of similarities to it. It has a very interesting kind of dissolving sugar feel that does give it just a unique, more interesting profile. At the same time, it's offering a little bit of traditionality to it. It has a little bit more body. It has a little less of the brightness and plenty of that berry fruit intensity to give it some depth, complemented by a nice floral component. So very red themed in that sense. Kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything from Mel, I'd definitely love to hear your thoughts and impressions of it, or them as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Tolima Alberizon Prada Geisha, wash processed Colombia from Mel Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.